Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending our 13th Salem Lit Fest. I'm Diane Stern, and I've been working with a remarkable group of Salem Athenaeum staff and volunteers who've been working for most of the year to put on this weekend of books and discussion, and so far it's just been great. I am extremely pleased to introduce this session, The Treeline, the Last Forest, and the Future of Life on Earth. Before the introduction is just a couple of things. There is an anti-harassment policy at the top of the chat, and though we don't expect any problems from you book lovers, it's important to us that everybody feels comfortable. Please put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. Put it in the Q&A. We'll do our best to answer them. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. This book has so much information. Extraneous comments can be put in the chat, but we'd like to leave that sort of to a minimum for disruption reasons and for interest of time. For closed captioning, there is a CC box on your screen and you can click that. And now to our guests. Ben Rollins joins us from the UK. He's a former researcher for Human Rights Watch in the Horn of Africa. He's the author of The Treeline, as well as City of Thorns and Radio Congo, and has written for a wide range of publications, including The Guardian and the London Review of Books. Kirkus Review says The Treeline is a timely, urgent message delivered in graceful fashion. And I think it reads like a novel. It is nonfiction, but it has that wonderful flow. Ben is the founder and director of Black Mountains College in Wales, which is dedicated to teaching the skills necessary to mitigate and adapt to climate change. We'll have more on that later. I'm sure you'll be interested in that. He lives with his family in Wales, and you can find him at Ben Rollins. Barbara Moran is an award-winning science journalist who's written for many publications, including New Scientist, Technology Review, and the New York Times. Her television documentary credits include the PBS series Frontline, The American Experience, and Nova. Barbara was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT, and she is now an environmental correspondent at WBUR in Boston, specializing in climate science and solutions. Welcome to you both. Over to you, Ben or Barbara. I don't know who would like to take it first.
Hi, it's great to be here, Ben. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining us here in the States. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I read your book over vacation and had so many questions. So let's get going. So, it's funny, when I read your book, I never thought about the tree line in a way. I thought the tree line was just when you're climbing a mountain and eventually the trees kind of end, right? And that's what I thought it was. And then, I don't know, it was such an eye opener. So for people who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, can you just sort of explain what a tree line is, what the global tree line is, and sort of what's happening there and why it's of interest?
So yes, you're right. It is the growing limit of trees, but that limit is not just up a mountain; it's also up a planet. So as you go further north, the environment becomes more hostile for trees. But the thing about it really is it's not a line, and it's also not static. So over time, it moves. And after the last ice age, the tree line was somewhere in North America, it was somewhere through the middle of the continent. And then it progressively moved north again as the climate warmed. Historically, it's moved, during the Holocene, the last 10,000 years since the last ice age, it's been moving a few inches every year. But now it's moving, in some cases, hundreds of feet every year. So those trees are really, or not the individual trees, they're not walking, but the forest as a whole is reproducing and is taking over the Arctic tundra and is moving towards the North Pole at accelerating rates. And what that means really is that ecosystems are in a process of flux. They're undergoing huge geological changes. And of course, all of our systems of society, all our societies and our economies and our, in some cases, our infrastructure is built on ecosystems remaining pretty stable. But the fact that they're transforming so fast poses huge, all sorts of actually unknown complications for how we've organized our own civilization up to this point.
Can you give me an example of one of those? Because it is striking how, I mean, I guess one of the things that struck me in the book was about how some of the, I guess, the oil companies that work up in the Arctic are, now having to deal with this quickly changing climate and doing it by like refreezing the ground, right? It just seems like kind of insane. But yeah, can you give me some examples of how this quickly changing ecosystem is affecting?
Yeah, so I mean, on a most basic level, if you take Siberia, for example, the fire dynamics in the south of the forest belt are burning up more and more of the forest. We've seen massive forest fires across the globe this year and last year. And when the vegetation grows back, it's not always the forest reproducing itself as it was. So in Kazakhstan and Mongolia, you have the desert advancing north and the forest retreating. So that has big implications for the amount of carbon that the trees can sequester. It means that agriculture is shifting north. So you've got massive boom in wheat farming in Vladivostok in the far east of Russia. The other thing that shifts is the ecosystem services that those trees provide. Yeah. So you may have heard of this concept of flying rivers, where essentially trees near the coast condense and transpire moisture. They seed clouds. Those clouds then so for example, rain that falls in the Andes may have been transpired 20 times by trees falling as rain and then being condensed again and again, because the forest pulls that moisture and that rain into the interior of the continent. And that's called the teleconnections between different zones. And we've got that in Alaska between the boreal forest and the grain belt in Canada. You've got the same in between Ukraine and the boreal forest in Russia. And those teleconnections are weakening as the forest is being dispersed and burning up and shifting and so on. So those are two really good examples of how our agricultural patterns are changing as a result of the transformations in the boreal forest.
It's so like when you're talking, like when you talk about these like global systems that are shifting, I start getting that climate change panic that I've been dealing with as a climate change reporter. And I felt like I was going to save this question for later, but I felt like throughout the book, there's this tension between like climate panic and sort of climate resignation. And I just want to read this one line that really stuck with me. Hold on, let me find. Okay, the unnatural has become natural. The apocalyptic has become prosaic, a perennial event merging into the background. This is perhaps one of the emerging realities of climate breakdown, that grief is a luxury. And can you talk, like, I felt like as I was reading the book, like you as an author were sort of struggling with this too. And can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot to unpack in that point. I mean, the first one is that I'm very keen that we are real about the science and that we're up to date. And for example, 1.5 degrees is a physical impossibility because of committed warming. And many people don't know that because the climate we're currently experiencing is the result of carbon emissions which we emitted 20 years ago.
And just make sure everybody's on the same. So 1.5 is the
degrees Celsius of warming, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement, beyond which people say that ecosystems and the climate becomes unstable. and so the first thing is to say, yeah, we are going to get to that place. We are already well on the way, and as essentially the climate is playing catch up with the amount of carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere, and that process will continue even for another 20 years, even if we stopped all emissions now. The flip side of that is that our imaginations are playing catch up. And I think that's what I was getting at in terms of, the apocalyptic becoming prosaic, is that we think we live in a place where seasons are regular, where the forest is in a sort of eternal presence, and where we take our surroundings for granted. But actually, all of those things are have become unstuck in a way. They're fluid, they're moving. I think you probably experienced that more viscerally in North America than we have in Northern Europe, at least this year. So it's that sense of, now, how do we make sense of this? We can see the science, we know the science, but also there's an embodied reaction now. We all live in places, we rely on ecosystems and plants in different ways, and all the other processes that the currents and so on. So it's that, in a way, the book for me was a whole process of trying to make sense of how we look at nature, and how we look at ourselves within it. So yes, there is this tension, but the last thing I'd like to say really is around panic and anxiety. Was again trying to approach that in a kind of scientific way, and say, right, well, what does this mean? How do we deal with that? How do we live in uncertainty? What other corollaries are there for human experience of living in uncertainty? Now, for many indigenous people who have lived through the end of their civilization, that's not a new experience. For many of the communities I work with in Africa, living in refugee camps, or in Congo, where there was no government, the forest was in free fall and all this kind of stuff. Those are the kinds of examples that we need to learn from.
Yeah.
How do people live in those circumstances? How do you live in a war zone? We're not there yet, but we need to get used to that level of uncertainty, and actually draw a lot of solace and comfort from that, because there are, and my previous two books in a way are a bit of a guide to that. There are whole populations. There's 250,000 people living in a refugee camp for 30 years in northern Kenya, and they've made a world, and they've made a meaningful world. And it's not great, and their human rights are massively curtailed, but they're not all killing themselves, and nor are they despairing entirely. Mental health is a problem, but there is human community there. There is life, there is love, there is laughter, So it's that sort of, I suppose, leveling of the playing field that I'm also interested in.
Yeah, that is so interesting. There were a number of the stories of indigenous communities in the book did have that sort of feeling of hope. Would you mind talking a little bit about sort of one of them?
Sure. I think the one that I found most affecting was Pimachuanaki in Canada, which is a Anishinaabe town called Poplar River on the shores of Lake Winnipeg. And what was so fantastic about their experience was that Pimachuanaki is now the largest protected area of forest in North America, about the size of Denmark. It's a huge chunk of boreal forest, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And these guys pursued a 10-15-year campaign to get it protected, basically as a way of coming to terms. The root of the project was actually them trying to come to terms with the social problems which they were experiencing on the reservation.
Yeah.
And they engaged what was called a Back to the Land program, where they took the elders and some of the younger people who were having issues and got them to talk in their indigenous language on the land, regaining that knowledge and the culture and the stories of the land. and it had an incredible impact both on the social outcomes in the reservation, but also then in terms of the broader ambition to protect the forest. And they acknowledge that the forest is shifting, but they're probably much better set up than many other communities in Canada, because they understand the changes that are taking place. They know that the fish are going there instead of there. They know that this grass is growing instead of that grass. And, they probably still source around 50% of their food from their local environment.
Wow.
So if supply chains start breaking up, they've got that knowledge, and they've got access to that territory, which the rest of us are not going to have. So all of a sudden they're really rich in terms of natural resources and skills and relevant expertise, even though they are hugely deprived and marginalized in Canadian society at large.
That is so interesting. Good. I mean, I like that. That's a sort of a good, right? A little bit of justice, sort of a little bit of climate justice happening. Right? So that's a good segue into, I actually have some, science questions about forests and trees. And just a reminder to the audience, for people who are listening, you can put questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll get to those at the end. Okay. So what was interesting to me when you were going around the tree line around the globe, that there were different trees. I guess I thought it was all, I don't know, this is so American-centric, but I thought it was all going to be the same trees around everywhere. And I was surprised that there were different ones. And I felt like, okay, this is maybe me, but I felt like some of the trees had different personalities, I don't know. And did you ever feel like that the trees had different personalities? And could you describe some personalities of some of the trees that you met?
No, I absolutely can. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to get to know the species, because part of writing this book was, I'm sure you appreciate this as a journalist, how do you communicate science to a population that probably doesn't really want to hear any bad news? So I tried quite hard to make this a travel book. It's a journey of discovery, of wonder, of adventure. You get to know the trees, and I wanted to bring the trees alive as characters, precisely to do that, to reach a broad readership, so that you smuggle in the science in a way, but also the science is fascinating if you can make it accessible, and if you can also level with people about the reality of what this means, whilst also offering hope. I mean, the hope, and for me, being real actually is much more hopeful than sugarcoating it.
Agreed.
So there's an interesting thing to say about the ecology of the northern woods and why they are the way they are. But back to that image of the ice age, and when the ice cap was reaching much further down around the globe, it pushed all those species back to lower places. So the distribution at the top of the world is not all of these trees reproducing and sending their seeds out latitudinally. It's them growing up on the heels of the ice, coming up from their refugia further south. And that's why you get spruce all the way up to Alaska, because they came from a refugia in the Rockies, but they never crossed the Bering Straits. So in Russia, all of the larch came from refugia in China, and then exploded across the top of the Russian continent. And then in the UK, our climax species is pine, because it crept up from the west coast of Scotland, and then there's no spruce, there's no birch, there's no larch, and in the UK naturally at those latitudes. So that's why you have this amazing structure of pine, birch, larch, spruce, and then rowan in Greenland. And for a writer, that's a gift, this wonderful organization of 6 chapters that, all I had to do was then follow these species. So I spent quite a lot of time getting to know these trees, sitting with them, listening to them, understanding the science, but also, looking at them in the landscape, kind of trying to see in a way, I think the phrase I use in the books is to see with ancient eyes, to see like indigenous people see trees as fellow beings who have more wisdom than us, who've been here longer than us, who've got, so much to teach us. And I hope a little bit of that came across. But a good example is a granny pine. We call them granny pines in Scotland. Is sort of big, gnarled. They're always the ones that people draw faces of witches on. With all these knobbly, wind-swept branches. But I thought this one pine was 450 years old, dating from the Napoleonic Wars or something like that in Scotland. And I thought she looked lonely. And sure enough, I looked into the science, and it turns out that veteran pine trees, when they're supported by a network of mycorrhiza and other younger trees, are supplied with nutrients and carbon by their offspring in their old age. And in an intact forest, they can live to 600, 700 years old. But in Scotland, the mean age for all these veteran trees is about 450, and then they start to die because they're not getting that hospice care that they get from their offspring. So, some of these kind of instincts, and this is sort of back to the embodied learning kind of point, that some of these instincts actually are supported. These feelings actually are supported by the science. So, sitting and listening and sort of wondering, why are they the way they are, and how are they doing, and how do they communicate, and who's around, and who's in the neighborhood, and then seeing how they compete against each other. Like the birch tree is a real hustler.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. I didn't know how to phrase it, but I'm like, were any of the trees kind of like annoying, or sort of like a little bit? Yeah,
the birch is incredibly pushy, and they crowd out everything else. And they move super fast. I think I call them the rock star of the arboreal, because they live fast and they die young. And they burn up lots and lots of carbon. They shed loads of leaves. They build up the organic matter. They heat the permafrost. They cause a terrible mess. They destroy all of the grazing for the reindeer. And the Sami people, who I spent time with in northern Norway, they get so many resources from birch, from their tents and their spoons and their sleds and all this stuff, and yet the birch is now become their enemy, because it's destroying the tundra, which is the grazing habitat for their reindeer. So you ask them about the birch, and they get this kind of wry smile, and they're like, son of a bitch, and they have a kind of relationship with the species.
Yeah, it's interesting, like when to think about all these trees and their sort of complicated interaction with people in the landscape, and then you kind of hear about these governments with these climate plans, like, oh, we're going to plant 1 million trees and fix everything, and it's I don't know, it just seems so, I don't know what, shallow and silly or something. Can you just talk about a little bit? I guess there's this other line that you have in there about I'll just read this, about planting trees without regard for the symbiotic other half of the forest below ground may be less effective than allowing the ground to evolve into woodland at its own pace. So that's what you said in the book. And can you just talk about this idea of a forest, a functioning forest, and what that offers us versus just idea of like planting trees?
Sure. Yeah. So a forest is a complex society, and it takes a long time to evolve. And it's also an experiment in co-evolution, because the mycorrhiza, the fungi under the ground, have a certain idea about what's good for them, and the trees have an idea about what's good for them, and the understory. And there's this dialogue between, and even between the flowers and the bees and the insects and the pollinators, and this whole conversation is going on all the time. And if you simply plant rows and rows of trees, you're just striking one note in an orchestra on its own, and that is sequestering a certain amount of carbon, perhaps, but it's not giving you the rich resilience and the density that a forest would give. old growth forests are now shown to be way more effective at sequestering carbon than plantations, even though a lot of industry funded research suggests that fast growing trees sequester more carbon. Now, yes, but only in certain circumstances and so on. So ecology is really complicated. The planet is abundant and multifarious in all of its wonderful ways. And if you allow, again, there's a lot of research to back this up, but if you just allow a patch of ground to rewild itself, then there will be a natural dialogue about what's best for that patch of ground. Mm-hmm. And after 20 years, there'll be a vigorous forest growing there, because all nature tends towards forest unless it's limited by certain factors. And often that forest will regenerate quicker and be more resilient and have more appropriate species than if you planted it yourself. So it's a real challenge to the human control instinct to try to just let stuff go. But actually there's substantial research now to show that that's actually a lot better.
That's so interesting. I was thinking, because there is all this beyond tree planting, this new effort at rewilding places. So you think maybe the best way of rewilding is just leave it alone. And then I'm also thinking about myself as a parent, and right, how it's completely against your instincts, but maybe you should just let them go. But yeah, do you think that about rewilding? Is that really the best, or what?
I think, based on all of the conversations I've had and all of the different projects I've looked at, I think generally, yes, natural regeneration is the most effective and the most cost-effective way of restoring nature. That doesn't mean that then there's a second conversation, which is, okay, what land do we allocate for rewilding? How much should it be? So in the Welsh government, for example, here in the UK, has just published new guidelines that 10% of all farms have to be forested. So that could be little boundaries. It could be actually orchards, which you then have grazing within, and if you start to scratch beneath the surface, lots of forests were never simply wild. They were always being I wouldn't say managed necessarily, but they were being optimized for certain outcomes. So the Native Americans in North America were clearing large areas in the savanna for game, to promote game. Then you have lots of stories in the Amazon of people burning particular strips and then using biochar to grow vegetables in the shade of the trees. Same with coffee. All these different ways in which you can garden forests in a way to promote different elements, and it's hugely productive. Probably way more productive in terms of calories than just plowing up lots and lots of fields for maize.
So interesting. You traveled all around the Arctic, I guess, is it called the Arctic Circle for the book, and to all these different places? Do you have, I always like the behind the scenes reporter stories. Is there anything especially memorable about the reporting experience, or what's your favorite story to come out of that?
I think Russia is just the most strange, certainly for somebody raised in the UK. And also it was the most extreme. So to get to 72 degrees north, where the furthest growing limit of trees on the planet, to see these trees, which have evolved in the most amazing circumstances. This large forest, which essentially lives in 30 centimeters of soil, and its roots can't go below. So the trees are very limited in terms of how high they can get. But the most interesting thing there was just the attitude of the Russians. So I'd interviewed Russian scientists who were incredibly frustrated at the amount of funding and all that kind of stuff. But then to go right to the north with these two drivers who didn't really believe in climate change. We had 500 gallons of diesel in the back of the truck in order to, you couldn't turn the engine off for 4 days because the thing would have stalled. And then you have to light a fire under the truck to get it going again. So they didn't believe in climate change. They were really annoyed. They didn't want to go in the dark in February to this place. And when we got there, they were so happy that the trees hadn't moved. And they said, oh, you see, you say the trees are moving, they're not moving. And of course, they're not moving at 72 degrees north because it's just too damn cold still.
Yeah.
And it's not -60, it's -40, but that's still not enough to push them. So we had this, you know, this very funny relationship all the way along, and a translator who was equally skeptical, you know. So being on this climate change mission with Russians who didn't believe a word of it and who thought Putin was the best thing ever, was a lot of I wouldn't say fun, but it was very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Did you try, I don't know, what do you do when you like intersect with people who don't believe in climate change at all? Do you just listen to hear what they say, or do you try to?
I think I've thought quite a lot about behavior change, and I used to work in politics. So how do you change people's minds is a really tricky question. And I think you have to work, you have to respond to an opening. You have to respond to it. You have to be invited to give your opinion. So I actually didn't say very much. But the last day we were there in the north, we met an ornithologist who told us this story about the birds of the boreal forest, which he had been seeing very far north in Arimas National Park, where the trees were. And yes, the trees weren't moving, but all of the inhabitants of the forest had already moved. So he was seeing birds like ravens, hoopoes, all kinds of geese that shouldn't be at that far north. And that really stayed with the translator. And he's a smart guy. He started to think about that. And then he asked me a question right at the end. He said, where should we move? And I said, you know, north in the first instance, but you know, that also then triggered a reaction in me, which made me feel like, well, nowhere's safe. I mean, this is not like you go to a war zone and report on it, you know, which I'm sure, you know, you've had this experience, and then you go home and there's a kind of PTSD of how you square that with your reality. But actually, this is about the atmosphere. This follows us everywhere. The story doesn't let you go.
Yeah, there is this, people do ask me that sort of all the time, and there is this sort of sense among certain people, especially I guess rich people, that they'll just move somewhere ahead of all this, but there is no ahead of it, right? You know, so in a way your book addresses that too, is like how to like what you were saying before, is like how do we instead face it and live with it in some ways. There were just a lot of really memorable characters in your book too. Did you have someone who especially stuck with you in the book?
I think that translator, actually, Dimitri, I think about him quite a lot. I wonder how he's getting on. And how, you know, how he's sort of squaring that reality with where he lives and the country he lives in. The others were actually also were scientists in Greenland, which was another really, really strange kind of cognitive disconnect, when there's all this money and all these helicopters and infrastructure and monitoring, looking at the ice cap, and they can tell you exactly how many billion cubic square tons of ice have been lost this year and so on. They can measure everything, and it's all about, but all that effort is geared towards refining models so we can predict how fast sea level rise is going to happen and so on. And I said, well, you know, but you know what, essentially you're all being driven by models. You're not starting with the observations and then, you know, warning backwards. Everything's being driven by the model. And that's because of the IPCC process. But because the money goes into the models, doesn't go into the field research. But they had this kind of impossible impossible situation where they were so immersed in what was happening. They were so up to the minute. They were, they could understand everything, and yet they were so powerless.
Yeah.
And I've interviewed a lot of victims of human rights abuses and war and conflict and so on in Africa, and you see the way people talk and try and make sense of their trauma and so on. But I think what I was witnessing there was very much the beginnings of trauma, and well, not even the beginnings, it was underway, and their response was to plant lots of trees in Greenland, which is ecologically marginal. It's something, but it in a way it was probably more therapy than it was.
That's how it struck me. Yeah, I was wondering about that. Like the whole tree planting thing in Greenland seemed very peculiar to me. And yeah, I think that was the conclusion I came away with. I mean, what did you think of that whole situation ecologically? And can you, just for in case people haven't read the book yet, can you sort of explain what these scientists were doing in Greenland? And
so there was two different things happening in Greenland. One is the scientists who were feeling guilty about all the emissions that they were using to airlift lots of equipment up onto the ice cap. And they started a project called Greenland Trees to try and offset that. And that was a lot of, positive effort with conversely quite an unscientific understanding of ecology, because they were just basically planting whatever they could. But the other thing happening is there is a national arboretum in Greenland, which has collected hundreds and hundreds of species from across the boreal forest. And all of the projections are that part of Greenland, because of the ice cap, will actually stay more stable longer than other parts of the boreal forest. So in a way, you've got a really interesting repository there, like a library, a seed library.
Yeah.
So depending on how long things take to reach an equilibrium again after this disruption that we've kicked off, you could well then see the boreal forest re-emerging from a refugia like that. Wow. So it's kind of like a bit like an arc. So Greenland plays this incredibly interesting role in both the imagination, but also the future scenario planning of climate change in terms of both the ice cap, but also the forest.
That is so interesting. Just imagine like hundreds of years ahead with this little arc of trees in Greenland. Okay, we have some questions coming in. Just a reminder to the audience that you can type questions into the Q&A box. All right, so we have a first one in. What changes have you made? Oh, I hate this. I hate when people ask me this question, but now it's asking you, what changes have you made in your own life regarding climate change since you've been doing this research? On the spot.
Sure. So I founded a climate change university here in Wales called Black Mountains College, which is informed by a lot of the same research. And the conclusion of the book, the epilogue, if you do have the chance to read it, is in a way a kind of manifesto for how we should come to terms with this information, how we live with it, how we prepare our children for this uncertainty. And it is uncertainty. Like we're pretty clear about the environmental parameters of where things are going. After a certain point, there are various divergent pathways depending on the action we take in the next decade. But there is also a much bigger uncertainty, which is how human, social, and economic systems are going to respond. And that's where there's an awful lot of, I find, hopeful possibility. Because if we acknowledge that the status quo is broken and is leading us in a bad direction, actually, that's a huge opportunity. And there's a lot of work to be done. And for those of us who are progressive, who believe in social change, that's not just a life's work, but a generation's work that's calling us to that job. So for me, I find a lot of meaning and a lot of energy in being real about where we are and talking about it with other people that want to talk about it, not least because it makes you feel less alone, and it gives you purpose. So the college is for me is where I am at the moment. And we're launching our liberal arts undergraduate program. It's called a BA in Sustainable Futures. arts ecology and systems change, and we're taking applications from the end of this month for next academic year. So we want to build a generation of change makers is the short answer. So there is a direct link for me in that case.
That's wonderful. So here's another question as the tree line shifts northward in this hemisphere, does the composition of forest hundreds of miles south of the tree line also change? That's a good question. So is it all moving up? How is that happening?
All ecosystems on Earth are currently in a state of flux. They are all transforming in lots of different ways, and some more rapidly than others. So the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth. So you see more. We are further along that journey, if you like, in the Arctic than in temperate spots lower down. The other thing is that the temperate zones, so Europe, for example, it historically always has a much wider climate niche. So there's a lot more change, variability on a year-by-year basis anyway. Whereas the ecosystems in the north are very finely calibrated. And that's the same for the ecosystems in the tropics. So when my first introduction to climate change was in the Horn of Africa about 20 years ago, with these compounding droughts, where very, very tiny shifts in moisture and the monsoon would have big changes on land. So there are parts of the planet that are more sensitive than others, but everything is changing, and species are going to shift and are going to continue to shift rapidly. And that's going to be things like budworm and dying and lots of pathogens. We've got ash dieback here, we've got oak disease, things like that. So it's trees changing, but it'll also be invasive species. So, loads more things that like warmer soil and stuff like that.
Anything good might come out of it?
I mean, change isn't necessarily bad, right? Yeah. It's just hard to manage, and it's hard to adapt to, because we're used to, like all the nursery rhymes, we're gathering nuts in May, harvest festival in September, these things are changing. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, although there's a lot to grieve when we lose all of our cultural associations with ecosystems and seasons. But there's opportunity there as well, and there's work to be done to make sure our kids understand these systems and get ready for the new species that are coming.
Yeah, right. I think you mentioned somewhere, but like this, our kids, like the next generation, are going to be maybe the first generation that doesn't have a stable climate, or maybe that will just be their normal, right? It
will, and I think but the way, when my children ask me about it, I point out the fact that actually the climate I've experienced is already very different from the climate my father experienced. So he owned a pair of ice skates. Now, there's absolutely no way I've ever been able to skate on a river or a lake in the UK in my lifetime, but for him that was normal.
Yeah.
So just small changes like that to show that actually this is a process that's been underway for a long time. There's no one generation that you can particularly point the finger at. We're all victims of these historical processes, and we all have to learn to play a role in, trying to slow it down, and trying to adapt and understand what it means, and ensure a just and habitable planet for as many people as possible, as a result. So I think the line at the end of the book is, we must prepare our children for the changes to come, but not as victims. We must prepare them as stewards. So humans have been a keystone species in the Holocene for 10,000 years. We've driven a lot of positive changes. We managed the boreal forest precisely to promote biodiversity so that we could harvest it before. And we've done the same thing in the fens in the UK, in various ecosystems in the Amazon and so on. So we have been a positive keystone species, and there's no reason why we can't be again.
Great, I like that. All right, good. Another question from the audience. Could you talk about the issue of methane? The scientist who talked about that, I guess, in the book, was the only one who seemed to raise this issue. And along that, can you also this probably come into it, but the issue of the thawing permafrost and how that figures in.
Yeah, so methane is a real wild card, and it's a very tricky problem, and it's the subject of an awful lot of research at the moment in atmospheric science. So what happens? So the permafrost is where most of it is, but it's also in wetlands, and it's also in oil wells. So it's a byproduct of oil and gas extraction. And it's 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So the more carbon dioxide we emit, the more methane we get, and the methane is an accelerant. So it's like a chaser, and it speeds up the warming. So then you get more carbon dioxide, get more methane. So it's a key feedback. And as the forest moves north, those roots go into the ground. They help melt the permafrost. The trees attract more snow. It doesn't get blown off, which also then insulates the ground. The permafrost melts more, you get more methane. So you've probably seen bubbles coming out of lakes in Siberia, in Canada. There's a lot of methane under the Arctic Ocean, under the sea ice, because that permafrost is not only on land, it's also on sea, under the sea. The difference with the sea is as soon as the sea ice has gone, the sun's rays hit that dark seabed and they warm it up super fast. So the big worry for methane is not so much the terrestrial methane, but actually the marine methane underneath the seabed. And it's, one scientist talked about it as a 1 gigaton bomb of methane there. Now, if all of that was released at once, you'd get something like 25 to 50 years worth of emissions in one go, and the Earth would heat up, you know, like you chucked it in a furnace. So nobody's saying that is a you know, an imminent possibility, but also nobody can rule it out. How fast the methane is released is going to be a key issue in terms of the thermostat controlling the how fast everything else warms. It's I mean, nothing's unfixable in the sense that you know, if we stopped emissions now and we really put all our efforts into completely rewiring our economy and our society, then you would be able to slow that down and reverse some of the damage. But you're right to say that that it's not something that anybody's got any easy answers to. And the most alarming thing from my point of view is it's not in the models, because it's super hard to measure and it's really hard to model. Methane is not in the IPCC models. So all of that is based on carbon dioxide on its own. And actually, we're not taking account of what is an increasingly urgent problem as well.
Yeah, that, just for people who don't know, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the body that advises the UN on climate.
So every country in the world has put forward their scientists and their models to try and pool information to come up with the best case understanding of what's happening. And the IPCC every year does these reviews at COP26, COP27 to check on progress towards these goals, and to basically refine models so governments can have a basis for policy making. But it's only models.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So you're founding this university, and that seems like, you know, you're doing your part. Well done. And do you see other things going on in the world that give you hope? Because I do think it's easy to fall, especially, you know, I'm getting that, like, that agita again when we're talking about the methane and the permafrost. But what do you see out there that gives you hope about, you know, other things going on, things that governments or scientists or other people are doing?
So I think, I mean, back to the point about opportunity, really, this is, you know, we're at a moment in history where we're facing a reckoning with all of the assumptions that have governed most of the 20th century in terms of economic growth, hydrocarbons, and the way that we've organized our economies and and things like that. And so this is a huge opportunity to rethink stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing a lot of that happening. You're seeing some. There's a who was it? Some political theorists said, whenever there's a war, it's an opportunity for far-reaching changes, and you need to capitalize on that. And this is also one of those moments where everything's in flux, where you can see, Denmark, for example, flipping its entire energy policy overnight. You can see, France has just nationalized its energy infrastructure, all its electricity provision. So we can do big things at this time, and for me, as a kind of social scientist and human rights activist, which is my background, the world is always a mess, and the job is to try and make it as equal and harmonious and nurturing as possible, and that work remains. And there's even though the stakes are higher, and there's probably on balance more misery going on as a result of the climate impacts, there is a huge opportunity to advance the cause of equality, justice, collaboration, to deal with some of this stuff. So I think there's a lot of positive thinking going on, and a lot of big changes happening in the way that people understand colonialism, capitalism, history.
I see Diane popping back. May I ask him one more question before we go?
Yeah, if we have maybe 30 seconds or so.
Okay, this is very quick, but I was just the big news about Queen Elizabeth dying, and King Charles is very into environmental things and climate change. And do you think that might help move things forward?
I think it could, yeah. I mean, he's made public pronouncements before which have helped shift the needle, and if he's willing to take a risk and be more outspoken, unlike his mother, then yeah, we might see some further benefits there. Yeah.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Well, and here's the book, The Treeline, The Last Forest, and the Future of Life on Earth. It is wonderful. It reads like a novel. You have to get it. Ben and Barbara, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the Salem Athenaeum and to all of our sponsors. Many thanks, of course, to our audience. If you'd like to buy our LitFest books, including The Treeline, you can check out our sponsor, Wicked Good Books, in Salem, Massachusetts. I know people are viewing this from all over the world. Copper Dog Books in Beverly, Massachusetts, or of course, your favorite bookseller. Our festival is free, but that's only because of your support. And if you'd like to donate, please head to salemlitfest.org and click donate. Up next at 10 o'clock, our panels, we have two of them. Everyone's reading LGBTQ plus novels, also addressing racial tension in historical fiction. And if you'd like more discussion about climate change, The Forest for the Trees is another panel coming up. I know, Ben, you said you wanted to tune into that. Climate and fiction. So that's a little different, but it's going to be great. But the authors are terrific. That's coming up at 4 o'clock this afternoon. And then I have to tell you, I have the image of that granny pine in my head. It's going to be with me all day. Thank you so much again. And to everybody, enjoy the last day of LitFest 2022. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.